Welcome back to the Bible in History. I'm Jeff Johnson, and with me today, of course, is my mother, Rebecca Johnson. And today we're going to be talking about Mesopotamia, one of the civilizations that sprung up after the Tower of Babel and the dispersion of languages there. And so we're going to be talking about that. It used to be considered to be kind of the cradle of civilization. And so there's a lot of interesting things about it, and the speed with which it grew, and which all the civilizations after the flood or the Tower of Babel grew. So we're going to be talking about that and some different interesting things about all of its growth.
Yes, I'm excited. I've chosen to begin with Mesopotamia simply because for many years now, we've been taught in school about the cradle of civilization and Mesopotamia, and so it's what we have in our mind. But as we go along, I do want to point out that most of these civilizations are literally just years, maybe 1 to 2 years apart in their beginning. But I do want to start with what we learned as children, what I certainly learned as a child, was the cradle of civilization, which is kind of amazing because I went to a Christian school. And this whole concept of the cradle of civilization is an evolutionary concept. So,
and it's
kind
interesting.
Of a theistic evolution.
It's interesting too because growing up, I'd hear pastors and whatnot and teaching about how the Garden of Eden was probably in the same area because of this concept of the cradle of civilization, and that whole region was the beginnings, and that was where the Garden of Eden was, and we could just ignored all kinds of different Bible facts and science facts about the destruction of the world during the flood. So this has definitely creeped in a lot into Christianity's mindset. And it's something I think that's very subtle. It's not something that we think of as being evolutionary.
Right.
But it is. It's very much that concept of we grew up in this area from the apes and whatnot. It's kind of funny because I don't think there's that many monkeys there, but whatever.
No. Now that you mention it, I guess they all evolved.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so why would Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamia is kind of a very bland term. We're going to talk about specific cultures here in a minute. But why would that maybe be the very first out of the gate? Well, because it's the very closest to where the Tower of Babel was.
Yeah.
And also, they would have already been extremely familiar with what was in the surrounding area as far as your minerals, your tool abilities, and they would have already known this so very quickly. So what are the individual civilizations? We're talking like the Canaanites, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Chaldeans, the Perizzites, and the Egyptians would have all pretty much simultaneously started.
Yeah.
Okay. And in fact, we have already discussed the fact that even evolutionary archaeologists are now claiming there are multiple cradles of civilization because they have no other way to explain why these civilizations just popped up out of nowhere quite quickly, all around the same time. So, we've already mentioned distance is the only factor that's going to factor in between all these civilizations that are springing up and even going into India and China, all the way up into Europe, and then over into the Americas. It really was quick. So let's talk about the Akkadian people. They're going to settle in the north of the Mesopotamian region. So you have the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, and they're in the north. Well, isn't that interesting? Because we've already determined that would have been very close to the region where the Tower of Babel was located.
Yeah.
So they are the closest to the Tower of Babel. Therefore, ta-da, the first. And
I don't
believe
suspect it would
probably-
have taken them more than a few weeks to get to that location from where they were.
No kidding. Exactly.
I've seen,
yeah.
like, crossing the entire portion of Ireland takes like 2 weeks, I think it was, on foot, and it's, I'd say, roughly that same distance. So you're talking a few weeks at max, and then by the end of the year, you've got your first houses and buildings set up. So it's a very short time.
Exactly. So I believe too that the Acadians were probably the strongest people, because you would want to be closest to the resources you know.
Yeah.
Therefore, warring situations would break out, pushing weaker families further on to find new resources.
Right.
Because you're not going to want to waste your time having to go find a new resource, find new ways to get these resources out when you know right where they are. So I suspicion the Acadian were probably the fiercest and strongest of the group. The Sumer people then would settle in the southern end of that, split between the rivers.
Yeah.
So you have your little split coming up. They do not come from the same source, by the way. That's important. They come from two separate sources, but they do run parallel at a kind of a V. And so the Acadians are in the north, closer to the Tower of Babel. The Sumer people head to the south. The Acadians called them the Sumer. The Sumers called themselves the black-headed people. So that's telling. We at least know what color hair they had.
Yeah.
The black-headed people. The first city settled by the Sumerians was Eridu, according to their own writing. Now here's the kicker. Let's come to today. Archaeologists today are discrediting their own written history because radiometric dating states that another city was first. But radiometric dating has major flaws. That's a whole big long topic. Major flaws in radiometric dating. And quite frankly, it would be like, I live in Brazil, it would be like a Brazilian saying, well, George Washington wasn't your first president because we dated his bones, so we know. Hello? So
yeah, if they're going to write it in historical texts and you found those texts, those are going to be, those should be accepted, because like, why are they going to lie about their own history? Like, that doesn't make sense.
Their own city.
Especially like
Their
your
own
first city. Like,
yeah.
I'm going to lie about my first city because reasons?
Yeah. Now, we do know that in history, of course, they do lie about winning battles, but they don't lie about where their cities are located. So that's kind of an odd thing there. But they consider their first settled city as Eridu. The first ruler of Sumer in the south, whose deeds are recorded, is a king by the name of Etana of Kish. In the king list, he is described as he who stabilizes all lands. So Etana of Kish, meaning the stabilizer of lands. The Sumerian king list is a cuneiform document. Immediately we have writing here, guys, and think about it. They have left the Tower of Babel with a brand new language, and yet they're already writing their language.
Yes.
It was written by the scribe in the city of Lagash around 2100 BC. This king list will list all the kings of the region, their accomplishments, and it is showing continuity of society that dates back to the beginning of civilization. So this king list is actually showing what's going on. They believe the king list was written to legitimize the reign of a king named Atu-Hegal of Orek. He wanted to prove he was related to the other famous kings. This has happened in the past. And it's interesting that in the description of Etana, one of the kings in the list, it's very similar to Nimrod. Yes. So we have to keep in mind, and I'm going to use the name James, okay? So in English, we say the name James. In Brazil, in Portuguese, we say the name Tiago. There is nothing remotely similar between Tiago and James.
Yeah.
And that's something you really have to keep in mind as you go through the history of ancient history, that names can be the same name, but it doesn't sound the same at all, depending on the language. So Etana is more than likely Nimrod of the Bible. And he is listed in the Sumerian king list as the beginning of civilization. And of course, this is after the flood civilization. We know there was a whole massive, very advanced universe before the flood, and now we're starting over. The Sumerian people built various cities at the exact same time that the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Indians, the Greeks, the Akkadians, and European groups are building. It's all happening at once, and we have to keep that in mind because we get so confused about this, the way history is presented to us. So what was like life? What was life like for the Akkadians and the Sumerians? Well,
what was life?
It was very advanced, to be frank.
Yes.
They had sewer systems. This idea that we came up with this, no, we remembered this after we forgot it. They had sewer systems of baked bricks. They had a very vast musical knowledge. They have found beautiful harps made of silver and blue lapis, which they got through trade, which proves that all the other civilizations had to establish because they had to trade with somebody, guys. So
yeah, if there's nobody to trade with, you can't trade with them, you know?
Exactly. So they're very active in trade. They kept accurate time down to the minute and second.
Yeah.
They built with arches and vaulted ceilings. This is stuff that we attribute to the Middle Ages. And in fact, they were already doing it straight out of the Tower of Babel, vaulted ceilings and arches. They used advanced math. They had accomplished jewelers and potters. They're engraving their figures and things like on the front of their harps. Incredibly intricate and amazingly beautiful. Trade was an important part of their society, and they knew of a world beyond their own city. They were not ape-like creatures. They were extremely advanced. They had complex religious systems with, unfortunately, multiple gods, which they had taken from the Tower of Babel straight with them. Hundreds of ziggurats in the region. So again, they are building the pyramids the same shape and form as the Tower of Babel more than likely was. Obviously, they didn't learn from their mistakes.
Nope.
They had writing, we already discussed, they had cuneiform writing. And we can say, well, that was a very basic writing. Well, actually, maybe it wasn't as basic as we think. It took us forever to figure out how to read it. Just because we chose to use Arabic form letters doesn't mean we're any more advanced than another society. Because let's face it, the Chinese and the Japanese have far more advanced technology today. And they use shape symbols for their words. They don't use Arabic letters. So who is to say one form of writing is more advanced than another form of writing? It just means you can't read it. So you think you're smart. Well,
yeah, just because you're using pictographs, the hieroglyphics, I know Chinese has evolved a lot, but they're still kind of based in that pictographic style of writing. Cuneiform, not necessarily as much pictographic as hieroglyphics in the Chinese, but definitely still a lot more symbolic. When you look at it, it definitely looks a lot like nails.
Right.
And very interesting design choices, if you will, for the lettering. But just because you're using that doesn't mean that it's less advanced. I'll use the example, using ASL, I'm learning sign language, and that's a very pictographic language, if you will.
Yes, it is.
It's very visual, but you can still use that to communicate full sentences and ideas with simple signs. I can use the same sign to ask a question one sign to ask a full question. So it's not primitive or underdeveloped. It's just different.
Exactly.
And to use pictures to make complete sentences can be difficult in and of itself. And the fact that they were creating these immediately after they had essentially had a new language created, there's a lot that goes into that in creating connections with the different sounds you're making and how this all works, and grammar and structure and spelling, all that kind of stuff. It's very complicated, regardless of what system you're using.
Yes. And it is interesting to note both the Akkadians and the Sumerians, he talked about the complications and the distinct things you need to do to create a language, both written and spoken. And they had scribes in both the Akkadian and the Sumerian civilization who recorded all of the transactions and the history of each city in which they lived or region. So they were writing their own history as they went, which is really, amazing. We tend to not even, in this modern day and age, we have our cell phone, we take 5,000 pictures, throw them up on the cloud, and assume that nothing's going to happen. It's going to still be there someday. I have a feeling we're going to have a black hole in history of this time period because we write nothing down. It's all floating in a cloud, and it's that quick for a government official to hit delete, and it's all gone, and history's rewritten. And yet these people took the time to write every transaction, the history of the city, what was going on, who was the king, everything about it, and that's amazing to me. They had mining, they had forestry, they had the ivory trade. They were very advanced. The Akkadians and the Sumerians would eventually be united together under Sargon the Great of Akkad. He's considered by some historians to be the head of the very first empire to speak of, the Akkadian Empire. It lasted around 150 years and then split off again into the Sumerian and Babylonian kingdoms. So we'll talk about them in the future. But I do want to hit this. What about the wheel? When I remember in grade school and in junior high and high school when we got to world history, and they're like, cradle of civilization, the Sumerians invented the wheel. Really? Did they? Okay. That just means they found a wheel in the region. I truly believe there are already wheels on Noah's Ark. We've kind of hit on this once before. So I'm going to just really quickly, as our time runs out, imagine this. Okay, there's a thing called the Atlantic Ocean Garbage Patch. This is a real thing. It's where a lot of plastic has come together in a big floating mass on the Atlantic Ocean. So let's fast forward 1,000 years, and you are an archaeologist, and you come upon the Atlantic Ocean Garbage Patch. Does that mean plastic was created in the Atlantic Ocean? Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
But you could claim that 1,000 years from now because you don't know what happened. That somehow magically the ocean created plastic, and there must have been a civilization here that did this, when in fact the whole world threw their garbage in the ocean and it all came together and it's floating around. But 1,000 years later, that's hard to see. This is a similar thing. Yes, they found wheels in Sumer, but they also found wheels in Egypt, and they found wheels in China, and they found wheels in Europe, and they found wheels everywhere else. And so if you will take away the blinders of evolution, you can see, the wheel came off the ark. They all took a wheel with them because imagine you're leaving the ark, your family groups have now split up. You got to drag your stuff along. You
don't want to leave it there.
We're missionaries, and we understand this.
Oh, yeah.
So, yes.
You want your stuff.
You would take a dinosaur or two. You would take cattle. But what are you pulling? Well, it had wheels. And so, wheels came from pre-flood technology, came on the ark. Everybody had wheels. They were not invented in Sumer. They were probably invented by Adam and Eve, to be frank.
Yeah, it's not a hard concept to come up with, honestly.
It really isn't.
I mean, you just look at any kind of rock, and if it's circular, it's going to roll better than a square one. Well, I'm going to make a circle now. Woo!
So.
It's not hard.
So,
It's not that big of a discovery as they make it out to be. Important? Yes. Hard? Nah.
It
Child can make
does not show advanced intelligence. However, indoor plumbing shows advanced intelligence. So, let us point to these things. So, this is a little bit about what's going on in Mesopotamia, this magic cradle of civilization. Please debunk that from your mind. Everybody's rising up at the same time. Next time, I want to talk about, as we spread out, what's going on then if Sumer and Akkadian are not the first civilizations. They're not necessarily the first. Maybe they started a year before another or 2 weeks before somebody else. But if they're all starting at the same time, well, who else was out there? What else is going on? So we're going to talk about it next time. Pretty cool stuff. I'm super excited. So.
A lot of civilizations popping up. And we'll be talking about maybe not all of them, but definitely some of them. And we'll enjoy it, and we hope you will as well. So join us next week as we talk about that. We'll look forward to having you there.
If you enjoyed today's video, please like and subscribe to our channel.
You can also follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, and Google Podcasts.